Hi, everybody, and welcome to a webinar on hope and resilience. So thank you for joining us today. And I'd just like to check, we're going to be talking and sharing stories for about the next 45 minutes. So can you please make sure that you've got a cup of coffee, or in my case, the bottle of water, so that you're ready to settle in and share with us. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners on the land in which we're meeting, and in my case it's the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and pay my respects to the elders of wherever you're sitting from at the moment. I think most of you are in Western Australia, but pay my respects to the traditional owners in the area that we're beaming to with this webinar today. So what you should be seeing in front of you is a picture of the sun through some leaves. And what I'm liking to reflect on here is when I go outside and I walk out into the bush in my area, and I'm lucky enough to live on acreage and to be able to walk out into the trees. I see the trees, I see the rivers, the sky, and it makes me realise that with everything going on in the world, nature is really, really important. It's still there. It's important for feeding our soul and also for providing all of those services that we take for granted, whether it be pollinators, whether it be with, absorbing carbon dioxide, all of those things that are really important for life on this planet. And it really also grounds us at Bush Heritage. Maxima, next slide. And it gives us a reason for why we do what we do, why all of our 117 staff do it. It's about that healthy country protected forever. And we're really there to make sure that those glorious, pristine places within Australia that we all love are still there in the future for my kids, for your grandkids, for everybody to enjoy. So we're out there in the bush dealing with the feral animals, the weeds, looking at how we can utilise different management tools to help keep that country as pristine as possible and have it so that we have all of these fantastic species. Next slide. I know that many of you will know where we operate, but I just wanted to, I suppose, put up, a bit of a slide that gives a bit of a reminder. The fact that we're across the 37 reserves, and when I think about Western Australia, I think of those joys of Hamlin and being up near the stromatolites and being able to see those huge night skies, enjoy the vastness of it, and see the impact that we're making by removing goats and sheep off the landscape. When I'm at Urardi, looking at the revegetation project and the impact that is having, or down in the southwest, opening up a nest box, hoping for a pygmy possum or a honey possum and finding a skink, but knowing that our people down there have found those things like the honey possum or the malleefowl coming back into the area. Of course, we have properties throughout Australia, all within different landscapes, that are all really important for Australia and our heart and soul as a nation. We, of course, also have 25 Aboriginal partnerships, and the slide you should be seeing now is one of a lady called Jacko. She's part of the Kurrajari Rangers, who are based about 3 hours south of Broome in Budjidanga country, so near the town of Budjidanga. And she is there teaching me about the different plants, the different herbs, the medicinal nature of them. And I was very lucky to spend that couple of days really just immersing myself and learning heaps and just realizing how much knowledge we as an organisation don't have, and that there's so much to learn and so much that we can, with working together with our Aboriginal partners, actually understand and build into the way that we manage land in conjunction with them. So of the 25 partnerships, 14 of those are on Bush Heritage held properties and 11 of those are on Indigenous protected areas. But it's great to be able to learn together and actually be able to share that knowledge more broadly. Of course, we can't do what we do without our amazing staff, our volunteers, our supporters. And I know many of you on the phone call are volunteers and have been doing fantastic work helping us out. I know it's really frustrating at the moment, that ability not being able to get out there because of COVID, but I just wanted to say a huge thank you. And this image shows a range of our staff and our volunteers. That image on the left was before we had to unfortunately shut down some of the volunteering operations. And it was the early days of COVID. And we actually had the team at Scottsdale practicing their social distancing. And this is them walking back to the main workshop office area while doing a social distancing along the rail trail. Other pictures there, up on the top right, there's Greg, who is our reserve manager at Naree, working with Graham Finlinson, who's one of our ecologists. Down the bottom, that beautiful orange picture is actually my daughter, who was working with Richard. We were lucky enough to be at Hamlin when one of the palm trees lost a lot of its fronds. So Richard and Izzy got stuck into clearing that up, and it was great to see that connection and for Izzy to be able to work with Richard, learn more about the landscape while also doing the necessary work around the reserve. And the bottom right one is of a group of staff at Scottsdale. So our staff are out there continuing to do stuff at the moment. We very much have all of our reserve staff continuing to focus on weeds, feral animals and the ecological assessments, and they're being supported by those of us who are based more in a home office environment. What we're also doing at the moment, of course, is looking at how we use fire. So the next slide is of Bunuba country in the Kimberley, and so we have had a team member who has been out there helping with the cultural burning at the moment, obviously following all of the requirements of the WA government. But the fire preparation work in the Kimberley has been designated as an essential service. So we have been up there doing that work, but making sure that we're not mixing with the rangers. So we've got that separation and we're not in community as such. And we're also providing a level of background support. One of the questions I'm often asked is, we're obviously doing this fire preparation work now, but what happened to us over the summer? So the next slide shows a little photo which is taken from Barn of fern fronds, of these little pockets of green coming up from the fire. And we did have a number of fires. What I've tried to capture on the next slide is the 4 reserves where we had significant fire impact over the summer. We did have more fires. We did have fires at Charles Darwin, at Cravens Peak, at Carnarvon, and they went out relatively quickly. But we had a hot fire at Burn, about an hour east of Canberra, which basically it burnt the whole of the reserve. We had Scottsdale, which was the fire at the end of the season. That was the fire that came from Canberra through across the Murrumbidgee River and towards Breadbow. That impacted 60% of the reserve and unfortunately impacted a lot of the seedlings that were put in, but we're seeing them sprout back, which is absolutely fantastic. Yantabulla Swamp, that's near Naree, so we manage Naree and Yantabulla together. There we had a fire which took us 3 weeks to put out. It was a lightning strike, as all of these were originally started by lightning, and unfortunately that one we had to have a huge crew of people from throughout Australia coming together to provide that support. And then for some of our staff, fortunately, they got to spend Christmas Day fighting it. So at Yorka Reserve, the team up there, Paul Howes and his family and contractors were fighting the fire at Yorka on Christmas Day. That one impacted 40% of the reserve. So what are we doing now, given those level of impacts? And the next slide shows Phil Palmer, who's the reserve manager for Scottsdale, and our ecologist, Matt Appleby, looking at the herbs and the grasses and really just determining what we think will come back when. We are seeing those green shoots of hope, and we've had quite a level of rain across all those reserves, and so we are seeing them to come back. So I'd just like to share next a little quote from Matt, who's our senior ecologist. just in the southeast. But the fact that we are seeing these signs, and when I was at Barn at the end of February, I was seeing the fern fronds, I was seeing the epicormic growth. We actually spotlighted and saw some greater gliders. The neighbours had heard a powerful owl. We know that the bush has come back. At Yorka, we have a population of Mareeba rock wallabies. They're quite endangered, and we thought we might have lost them because they were in an area of Yorka that had quite a hot burn. So we put the camera traps out, and we were absolutely thrilled to bits when across the front of the camera comes a Mareeba rock wallaby. We have no idea where they were hiding out during the fire, but they are coming back, and we are seeing them, which is fantastic. And that reserve has had a lot of rain because it's in the dry tropics area, and it's recovering quite quickly. Another area that is recovering is the Ngari Yantabulla swamp area. So this area doesn't get rain that often, and only infrequently gets what we call a dry flood. So that's the water coming down the Parago and Kookaburra Creek from Queensland. We had water come through last year, got quite a level of growth. This year we've also seen that, and we've had the best water levels since Bush Heritage actually bought the property. So we've had the dry flood, and we've had a level of rain as well. So we're starting to see bird breeding in that area, which is absolutely fantastic. And we're hoping that we'll get a great bird breeding season there at Ngari. So as you can see, the bush is bouncing back. We're focusing on the weed management because unfortunately they bounce back as well as the feral management control to make sure that we tip the balance in favour of the native species.
So I think I'll just go into my presentation straight away, and then I'll welcome any questions as we go away, once we've finished. And like Heather, I just really want to thank everybody for joining us today, and thanks for your interest in the work that I'm doing, that you've tuned in. Okay, this is a project I'm doing. I'm doing my PhD on 3 reserves at Hamlin, Urardi, and Charles Darwin, and it's come out of an idea that Vanessa Westcott, who was the ecologist for our region, had with Professor David Watson from Charles Sturt University about the role of parasitic plants in the landscape. And we've got quite a few parasitic plants on our reserves, and we're just keen to find out, so, you know, how important are they, and what kind of conservation action do they require, and therefore what kind of specific land management might our reserve managers need to undertake to keep them in the landscape. And I'm really particularly interested in obviously their ecological role, but also their importance not just to our reserve staff, our ecologists and reserve managers, but also to the Aboriginal partnership groups that we are working with across all of those reserves. And these are some of the people who I've encountered at Hamlin with the Mulgana people, at Urardi with the Nanda people, and at Charles Darwin with the Butamaya people. And already I've done presentations to all of them, and they're really interested in this work because they have a strong connection with species like sandalwood and quandong. They're important bush bird and bush tucker species and of immense cultural heritage. And they're keen to make sure that those species stay in the landscapes and on country that they can come and visit and work with on our reserves. So they're a key part of my team, and I'll be working with them over the course of my PhD, and that's a really exciting aspect of it without a doubt. And the other people who are really part of my team are all the reserve managers at each of those 3 reserves. So I've got Ken and Michelle at Hamlin, Ben and Tina at Urardi, and now we've got Jessica and Dean at Charles Darwin. I was working very close with Will at Charles Darwin initially as well. And then of course the regional ecologist, Ben as the ecologist across those 3 reserves, but also Michelle and other people like Liz and Shani and Luke and others who have been immensely helpful in supporting my work, and including volunteers as well. We've got all the reserve managers are doing a monthly collection of leaf litter for Dave Watson for part of his experiment. And then we've got volunteers. I know Rex and Gail were caught on camera. I've got about 30 camera traps out there, and in one of them Rex and Gail pop up collecting leaf litter on one of the days. So it's great to have all of this team involved in this research. And basically we're looking at these 3 species. So everyone's very familiar with Australian sandalwood, Santalum spiccatum, and also quandong, good quandong jam stuff from Santalum acuminatum. And some of you may also know the leafless ballart, which is Exocarpus aphyllus. Now, all three of these species grow on all of those reserves, and they co-occur at quite a few sites. But they're all under a fair bit of pressure, especially sandalwood. This is a sandalwood tree on Hamlin Reserve. You can see it's been hit by goats on at least 4 different occasions, but it's still surviving. And Ken and Michelle have fenced that one off now and are watching it slowly recover and resprout, and in fact even had fruit on it in the last year. But you can see there's a lot of threats, and overgrazing is a big one, but also climate change. And so one of the things I'm looking at is, what are the functions, what kind of roles do these species have in the landscape? Why, how important are they where they are? And in particular, what species might be using them? So obviously a lot of animal species use these three species for food sources, such as nectar or foliage or fruit or seeds, but they also use them for shelter, to build nests in, to rest in during the heat of the day. And already my camera traps have shown a very, very strong association between a lot of fauna and these particular species. So I've obviously been catching kangaroos and euros on screen, but also hopping mice and dunnarts, a whole range of reptiles from ghouls, monitors, right down to small dragons and skinks. And then a huge array of birds, which we're capturing in the camera traps, but we're also capturing through timed observations, where I just sit out on the reserve for an hour at a time with my binoculars and just stare at a sandalwood or a quandong and a couple of the trees around it, just to see who's coming and going and what they're using these plants for. And that's given me a pretty good idea about, okay, they are important in situ, and therefore they're pretty important that we have strong conservation plans in place to protect them. Unfortunately, sandalwood, which is getting all the attention in this particular slide, this is at Hamlin, is also gets a lot of attention because it's a commercial forest product in Western Australia and has been harvested for now 175 years. And certainly from this stage of my research, I've completed my literature review, and I've also completed my second chapter, which is just about what is the status of sandalwood in Western Australia. And unfortunately, it's in quite a bit of trouble. One, because it has been very, very heavily exploited, mostly without any management for most of those 175 years. But also it is struggling under climate change, and it's also struggling because it's out of whack in its ecology in terms of its seed dispersal away from the parent plant. And that was traditionally done by booties and woylies, which have been lost from these landscapes now for about 50 or 60 years. And as a result, we actually haven't seen any regeneration on any scale of sandalwood for about 50 or 60 years. So it's like saying that there's a population of king penguins on an island that hadn't had any babies for 50 or 60 years. And if that was the case, ecologists all around the world would be screaming from the rooftops about something like that. But it's hardly getting a mention here in Western Australia. So I'm hoping that my research, and certainly as I publish various chapters in succession, really draws attention to the fact that this is a species in trouble. It's going extinct in the wild in the rangelands, and does need some real intervention to make sure it stays on the landscapes in the future. And that will be a role for our reserve managers and for our volunteers and for our partnerships with Indigenous people. And I'm certainly looking forward to playing a role in conserving sandalwood in the rangelands. So I'll leave it at that, and I'm happy to take any questions as we get into that Q&A session, Heather. So thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Richard. And I think, what I found fascinating there was that, if you said if this was a colony of penguins that hadn't had any babies, there'd almost be a global uproar. So how do we get that, attention back on sandalwood? Are you seeing any changes at all in the narrative around that and getting greater focus, or is it still a sort of a bit of a poor cousin compared to some other species that are I think part of the challenge too with, often sometimes people focus on fauna rather than, the flora, which is so critical to sustain them. So are you seeing any change in the narrative at all?
No, not really. I think you hit the nail on the head insofar as in any landscape, we're very quick to notice the fauna species and obviously the cute and cuddlies, but very little attention is turned to the plant species that they are so dependent on. And certainly in my research, one of the key things I'm trying to show is that there's a great quote from a book on ecosystem processes, and basically Mosley says every plant has its place. And so you can't just go into a landscape and selectively pull out all the sandalwoods and think that you have no impact on every other species in that food web, in that community. So I'm hoping that one of the things my PhD will achieve will be just to draw attention to the fact that you can't just look at anything in isolation, that everything is so connected in a landscape.
Thanks, Richard. We need some questions, please. I know a whole lot of you have worked out how to utilise the question and answer function on the side panel there. So please, if you could type in some questions, that would be great. We have one here for you, Richard. How is sandalwood going in the rangelands?
So certainly in the Western rangelands, they are disappearing. You know, my second chapter of my book on my thesis more or less says that they're going extinct in the rangelands. And if you get a chance to read David Pollock's new book called The Walloon Way, there's a great section in there where he talks about at one stage he was collecting sandalwood for sale, but then he noticed that actually he hadn't seen any baby sandalwoods, and everyone who he spoke to in his region, in the Murchison region in the Western rangelands, none of them had ever seen a baby sandalwood either, and it's been done for 50 or 60 years. So they're certainly disappearing. And although the Forest Products Commission is replanting sandalwood in the Great Western Woodlands around Norseman, across the vast majority of its range, sandalwood is disappearing.
Thanks. The next one is, have you seen any evidence that the lack of sandalwood is affecting the insect or spider populations?
Not yet. I'm not actually drilling down to that level, but I'm sure that that is the case. If you just look at a sandalwood or a quandong when it's in flower, it produces very sweet and very scented nectar, and that attracts a huge collection of insects. And I'm sure that once you lose those species from the landscape, that will certainly impact those insects, which have no doubt a pollination role with a whole range of other plants at the time, and also have a food source role for a whole range of birds and the like. And one of the key things about sandalwood and quandong is that they're opportunistic in terms of when they flower and fruit. And so they will make advantage of rain, and then they will flower just about at any time of the year if there's been some good rain. And so what is unique about that is that this is a species that will flower and fruit at times of the year when nothing else in that landscape is producing flower and fruit. And so insects that want to be around all year, this is a really important, and birds, really important for food for them.
Thanks. A comment here that person loves that every plant has its place, which I think we'll all be in agreement in that. Question in relationship to the WA Forest Products Commission. I know you mentioned about them doing some plantings, but have you got any update on what their stance is in relationship to the continuing harvest of sandalwood, whether that's changing?
So the Forest Products Commission currently has a licence to harvest up to 2,500 tonnes of sandalwood per year. And so they're continuing to do that. And they also have included in that licence, half of which can be greenwood, so live sandalwood trees that can be harvested, and half can be deadwood. And a lot of that deadwood is being harvested off the pastoral regions where there's a lot of dead sandalwood. And a lot of those contracts are in fact given to local Indigenous operators to go and collect dead sandalwood. So a lot of sandalwood is still being harvested. As I said, they have a licence for 2,500 tonnes, which is probably about 12 times at least of what might be a sustainable level.
Thanks, Richard. A query here about the threatened species status in relationship to sandalwood or any of those other species you're looking at?
Yes, that's a very good question. I gave a presentation at the WA Threatened Species Forum last year, and my title, which is what I've talked about just now pretty much, was when is a threatened species not a threatened species? And basically it's when it's already designated as being a forest product in Western Australia, then it fits into different legislation than if it was just a normal flora plant species in Western Australia. And so It's not listed as being threatened, although it is listed as a threatened species in South Australia. So apparently the border makes a difference between whether it is threatened or not.
I think you've just described some of the perversities of the federated structure that we live in, and we'd love to see some commonality and approach across the divides. We've got two questions that are very similar and really talk about the challenges around regeneration. So if we're missing those, faunal species that would have helped to regenerate sandalwood in the past, how do we actually go about regeneration for the species?
Regeneration will be a real challenge because obviously we can replace the role of those woylies and booties, which is what the Forest Products Commission has done. They've invented a machine that goes along behind a tractor and plants seed under host plants at the right depth. So we can proactively do that, and we can do that even at a smaller scale on our reserves by staff or volunteers or Aboriginal partners going around with big bags of seeds and planting them just at the right depth under host plants. But what we're not going to be able to replicate is the environmental conditions that sandalwood have enjoyed in the past that they're no longer enjoying under our increasingly arid conditions. And so we can't guarantee that they'll get 250 millimetres of rain in that year. We can't guarantee that they'll get a good break of rain around February and March and then follow-up rains around May and June. So unless we're prepared to proactively water those seeds and then fence them off from grazing and the other threats, including fire, or unless we are prepared to only plant them in places where we know that they will get good water, such as around watercourses or homesteads or the like, we're going to struggle to look after them at scale across the rangelands.
I think that probably brings us on to one of the other questions here as far as the impact of climate change. And I know in parts of Australia and we're doing trials in Victoria about taking seed from hotter areas and trying to build up a level of resilience from a climate change perspective. So I just wondering if you could share your thoughts on what you think the opportunities are there, but also what you might think the prognosis is, given that our planet is heating up.
No, that's also a very good question. Sandalwood in particular, we do know that it grows across a huge temperature gradient. So you'll find it right out in the desert country, and you'll find it right down into the southwest. And it used to be right throughout the wheat belt, fairly high rainfall zone above 600 millimetres of rain. So it grows in a huge gradient. But also we know that it has some ecotypes. So there is a northern clade, which is in the sort of more arid and semi-arid region. And there's a southern clade, which is down in the more mesic, moist area in the southwest. And so there's a real argument to say maybe we should be sourcing our seed from out in the desert country and bringing that down more into the southwest to make it resilient to those changing climates. We haven't done any work on that at this stage, so it would be something that would require some research to be able to demonstrate that is a viable approach.
Thanks, Richard. Another question we have here, and please keep the questions coming. We've still got lots of time, so if there's a question that you're thinking about as we talk, then please type those in. Next question is, what do traditional owners feel about sandalwood? Do we know what their perspective is and how important that that plant species is to them?
Also a very good question, and I don't think you can throw a blanket over traditional owners and say they all think this way or that way. Largely because, as I mentioned earlier, there are traditional owners across Western Australia who've got licences to pull sandalwood from the country. And I know that there was a parliamentary inquiry in 2012 to 2014, and one of the outcomes of that was that it received criticism that Aboriginal people had not benefited from the sandalwood trade previously, and they should be involved in the trade going forward. And so that was an outcome of that, and hence the current licences often to pull dead sandalwood. And there are a couple of Aboriginal corporations that have major sandalwood industries happening on country out in the goldfields. So certainly there's a strong involvement in the exploitation of sandalwood. And if I talk to people in this country where I work, you'll have people who say, yeah, my dad and my family have been involved in sandalwood harvesting in the past, and it was an important pastime for us, and we have some connection with it. But when I speak to the Aboriginal groups about the work that I'm doing, most of them are very surprised to find that sandalwood is not regenerating in the country and is disappearing, and they really are upset by that. And I've had Aboriginal people who in the past have been involved in pulling sandalwood who are now keen to work with me when this project gets to the right stage to look at how they might be involved in the restoration of sandalwood back in country that they previously harvested in. And so I think all the groups that I'm speaking to, as I said, they're surprised to find out that it's not regenerating and are keen to be part of ensuring it survives in the long term.
Thanks, Richard. I just, as I said earlier, encourage anybody who's got any questions, please keep them coming. I'd just like to add in one now. When you're not looking at sandalwood, because I know you're out in the landscapes a fair bit and you're doing lots of volunteering for us, which is really, really appreciated. What are some of your favourite species or favourite moments of being out there in the bush?
I'll talk about my favourite moments first, and then I'll give some thought on my favourite species. I'm very biased now. I've got sandalwood. I consider Steve Hopper from the UWA, now based in Albany. Steve's a close friend of mine, and we've done some work together, and Steve's been a keen supporter of this work that I'm doing. Steve's a big fan of everybody adopting a totem and saying, you know, let's have a species that we identify with and we actually want to do something special about saving. And so the two species that I have adopted, and you can call them totems if you want to, you can call them whatever you like, but they're just species that I really care about. And one, of course, is sandalwood. It's what I'm now thinking about pretty much 24 hours of the day, 7 days a week. And the other one is the Australian raven. I've always just loved ravens and their intelligence, but also just their quirkiness. I grew up on a farm in Calaveran, and there were always crows there, and they were always entertaining. So I've had them with me my whole life, and I always, when I'm out on the stations and on country, always pleased when I hear a crow call out and say, "What are you doing, Richard?" or "Get out of the way," or whatever they're saying. So certainly those are the two species that I identify with. But the stations and the reserves themselves are all incredibly special. The three in my region where I'm doing my work are all very special, but also all very different. And whether I'm standing on the veranda at Charles Darwin looking across towards Gundua, the Mount Singleton, which gives that country its character and its name, Gundua, or at Urardi with red-tailed black cockatoos swirling in the trees, the gum trees just outside the visitors' quarters, or up at Hamlin where Ken and Michelle are transforming an oasis into just an incredible landscape with the restoration of that country after the challenges of sheep and goats so recently is quite a transformation. So they're all very special, Heather.
Oh no, look, and they certainly are, and I'm glad you like the Australian raven, because it'd be fair to say they annoy the hell out of me because they're always going into my chook shed and destroying eggs. So I don't quite have the same love for them. We now have two questions that are probably more directed to me. So one of them is, Heather, do you detect any change among our governments in their attitude to action and the change in climate change in the wake of the fires? And has the Murdoch press won the battle in relationship to the narrative it's all the fault of the Greens? In relationship to governments, I'm seeing a lot of action by state governments in particular, and in the relationship to, you know, actually doing hands-on actions in relationship to climate change, but also in response to the fires. And I've sat in a number of DELP, which is the department in Victoria, as well as New South Wales, meetings of national NGOs, of government departments, working on both immediate as well as long-term pathways forward. I think that, look, there is still a little bit of some of the narrative about, you know, the greenies, but I think that's quietened down a lot. I think at a national level, we were getting really good traction as a sector. The challenge has now been that just with COVID, that has really swamped any work that was being done. So we were getting, you know, positive feedback and positive interaction, but that has unfortunately definitely been swamped because of that unusual circumstance that we're living in. There is a question in relationship to the bushfire devastation, and yes, we had a significant devastation along the east coast. We had, a few properties impacted. Obviously, parks organisations within New South Wales and Victoria had a huge amount of impact. And asking that question about have we seen a financial impact, we're obviously having to put additional resources into managing the work post-fire, and particularly into Scottsdale, where we had all of the seedlings impacted, and we've lost some of the really big, beautiful old yellow box and apple box trees. But we've also had some amazing support. So we've been supported by Earth Alliance, which is the Leonardo DiCaprio Foundation from the US, and they're providing quite a level of support for us into the East Coast, which is brilliant. We've had another couple of organisations also providing support. So we've had that great input financially to doing that. The bigger challenge at the moment for us financially is, like every other organisation, that COVID-19 has hit everybody's investments, and therefore the ability for some of our supporters to continue to support us has been reduced. But that just makes it even more important to say thank you to all of you, no matter whether it's 1 cent, $10, or in the case of Earth Alliance, $1 million. Every little bit helps and makes a difference for being able to have our people out on the ground. And because of the support we had post the fires, we are in a pretty reasonable condition so that we can continue to have our people do the fantastic work that they do. So we're okay as an organisation, but it has been a little bit challenging, shall we say, over the last couple of months. The next question I think is more for you, Richard. Which species surprised you most visiting Santalum?
That's a good question. I think none have really surprised me, because most of the species that I've been encountering in my camera traps are the same kind of species that have been popping up in pitfall trapping and other records on the reserves. And so, I'm getting hopping mice, I'm getting dunnarts and such, I'm getting skinks and geckos and monitors and the like. But maybe the thing that has surprised me the most is just how long kangaroos stay in the frame. Most things, if they get a white-browed babbler or a red-capped robin or something, it will dart in and then it will dart back out again. And my camera takes 3 photographs each time, and sometimes there's just a blur of a bird leaving on the third photograph to know that it was a white-winged fairy wren or something. But when kangaroos come into the frame, I think it's because the camera is mounted onto a star picket, a steel post, and so they end up nuzzling up as close as they can to the camera and spending sometimes 15 minutes having a rub up against it and inspecting it with their nose and their ears and their eyes. So I get all these amazing photographs of all different parts of the anatomy of kangaroos. So that's been surprising.
Thanks, Richard. You've painted a very vivid picture, and I can just imagine kangaroos rubbing up against star pickets. That's all of the questions we have, and our time has almost disappeared. So I'd like to say a huge thank you to all of you for engaging with us, for having the conversation. Obviously, a massive thank you to Richard, and thank you to everybody, our staff, our volunteers, our supporters. If you think of any questions as soon as you've hung up, which often happens to all of us, then please just drop us an email. We're happy to answer any questions that you've got, and look forward to continuing to share stories. And once we're through COVID, to having you all back out on reserves, having you in the magical landscapes and actually finding all those species that Richard talks about, being able to, see those kangaroos rubbing up against the star pickets, or in my case, trying to enjoy a raven in a different environment. So thank you so much for enjoying and being with us today. Really appreciate it. Stay safe, and we look forward to continuing to connect. So thanks, everybody, and see you next time.